The rain was a soft, insistent whisper on the metal roof, but inside the small, trembling body of a German Shepherd puppy made the sound of fear louder than any storm. His paws slipped against the slick tile as he stared at her. This human who radiated walls so high they almost seemed physical, almost impenetrable. She didn't move at first, just sat, arms crossed, eyes staring at nothing. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old blankets, and somewhere, a clock ticked like a slow heartbeat. He tilted his head, ears perked, tail hesitating mid-air, unsure if he should retreat or approach. He had been trained to trust, to read people, to know when hearts were closed, but this was new. He sniffed the air, catching the faint trace of her, the sadness wrapped around her like a second skin. And then, something shifted. A soft whine escaped him, the tiniest crack in his own growing nervousness. She flinched. She looked. And in that shared, trembling silence, the fragile beginning of a connection stirred, small as a candle flame in the dark. The puppy shivered the moment his paws hit the cold tile floor, his small body trembling like a leaf caught in a winter gust. The room smelled of antiseptic, wet blankets, and the faint, unplaceable scent of old sorrow. He froze, ears twitching, nose sniffing, taking in the figure sitting in the far corner. She was a wall-made human, her shoulders curled inward, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles shone white. Her eyes were fixed on nothing, empty and opaque, yet somehow aware. The puppy tilted his head, his soft, round eyes absorbing every nuance. The tension coiled in her muscles, the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the faint twitch of her jaw, as if she had been biting back something she had long ago stopped naming. He took a tentative step, claws clicking softly against the tiles, and paused, unsure if this human was friend or phantom, danger or warmth. Outside, the rain tapped insistently on the metal roof, creating a rhythm that pulsed through the room like the drumbeat of some hidden anxiety. The light was dim, gray filtered through streaked windows, painting the walls in slanted, uneven shadows. The puppy's fur caught the pale light, highlighting the soft folds of his small body, the delicate tremor in his legs. He lowered himself to the floor, belly brushing against the cold surface, tail wagging only slightly. Hesitant, cautious, yet unable to resist the pull toward her presence. He took another step, sniffing the air thick with antiseptic and fear, and then froze again as her gaze flicked toward him, brief but cutting. Her eyes did not soften, did not meet his fully. They scanned the room and then returned to that void she seemed to inhabit. But still, he felt something. A crack, a tremor in the invisible walls she had built. He inched closer, ears forward, whiskers quivering as he sniffed the floor near her feet. A soft whine slipped past his lips, delicate and trembling. The sound was small, yet it carried a fragile plea wrapped in instinct, curiosity, and the raw urgency of his tiny heart. She flinched at it, a motion so slight he almost missed it, but it was enough to make him pause, hesitant. He lowered his head, pressing his nose to the tiles, careful, testing. The quiet of the room pressed in on them both, punctuated only by the rain and the distant, low groan of wind scraping against the walls outside. The air was thick with tension and expectation, each breath a negotiation, each movement a delicate dance. He sniffed again, closer this time, brushing her shoe with his damp nose. She exhaled sharply, not out of fear but surprise, and in that instant, he felt the faintest stir of recognition, an acknowledgement that he existed, that he was seen, if only partially. He circled her slowly, one paw in front of the other, ears swiveling toward every sound. The faint drip of rain from the roof gutter, the subtle squeak of the chair as she shifted her weight, the soft hum of the fluorescent light above, they all became part of his understanding of this human. He sensed her wariness, the invisible spikes of her self-protection radiating outward, but he also sensed a quiet vulnerability, like a faint pulse under thick ice. He stopped, tail twitching, waiting, watching, willing her to move, to offer some sign that the cold fortress around her heart might soften. For a long moment, nothing happened. The puppy sat back on his haunches, tilted his head, and let out a small, almost inaudible whimper, a sound so fragile it seemed like it could shatter under the weight of the silence. And then, almost imperceptibly, her fingers twitched. She didn't reach for him. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at him fully. But the twitch was enough for the puppy to inch a fraction closer. Every step a negotiation of trust, every movement a declaration that he would not leave, that he would persist. The rain outside grew heavier, hammering the roof with a relentless insistence, and for the first time, he noticed the faint, warm scent that lingered around her. a scent of long-suppressed fear and resilience, of pain and a glimmer of something softer. He inched forward, paw lifted, then lowered, nudging gently at the edge of the blanket near her feet. She flinched again, sharper this time, yet something in her body loosened, just enough for him to feel it. He pressed his wet nose against the blanket, breathed in the air she had exhaled, and curled slightly toward her presence. A soft, almost imperceptible warmth radiated from him, the heat of life, of being, and he waited for a sign that his small body, his quiet persistence, might matter in the shadowed landscape of her heart. The clock on the wall ticked methodically, each second an eternity, each tick a heartbeat echoing between them. And in that tension, in that quiet, trembling space, the very first thread of connection began to weave, a fragile filament of trust stretching across the shadows on the wall. By the second day, the puppy had begun to map the contours of her presence. He learned the cadence of her breathing, the way her shoulders stiffened when she felt cornered by invisible ghosts, the subtle twitch of her fingers when she wrestled with thoughts she wouldn't share. Every movement, no matter how small, was a signal he tried to read. He padded softly across the floor, tail low but flicking at the slightest sound. A leaf scraping outside, the distant drip of water from the eaves, her muted sigh. Each sound was a language, and he was determined to understand it. Hesitant steps turned into careful circles around her chair, his soft paws whispering against the tiles, creating a rhythm that matched the faint tremor in her chest. At first, she didn't react. She watched him like one might observe a curious insect, distant, cautious, unyielding. Yet even in her stillness he sensed tiny quivers in her body, subtle cracks that begged to be noticed. He nudged the edge of the blanket near her feet, soft and gentle, ears alert, eyes wide and wet with hope. She flinched but did not push him away. He felt it, a faint loosening of invisible chains, the tiniest sigh of possibility. That sound, imperceptible but real, became his compass. Each soft whine, each tilt of his head, each delicate pawing motion was a question. May I be near? May I stay? May I show you warmth? She didn't answer, but the very act of remaining, of allowing him space, became an answer in itself. Rain had softened to a drizzle, leaving the air dense with wet earth and faintly mossy scent. Light fell in pale strips through the streaked windows, creating fleeting pools that shimmered on the floor. He chased one of these pools, pawing it with frantic excitement, spinning once, twice, then freezing mid-step when her shadow flickered across the tiles. Her eyes followed him, and for the first time she let her lips soften, the corners curling in a near imperceptible gesture that was almost a smile. His tail twitched with recognition, and he inched closer, ears forward, paws hovering in delicate balance, breathing the space around her. Slowly, cautiously, she extended her hand. Not fully, not with commitment, but enough for him to see the motion. He froze, muscles tense, ears swiveling in confusion and curiosity. Then, as if a tiny pulse of courage had traveled from her heart to his, he stepped forward, sniffing her fingertips, brushing them lightly with the tip of his wet nose. The warmth, the subtle human scent, the faint tremor of her pulse under skin. He absorbed it all, letting it flow into him. She didn't pull back. She didn't flinch. She simply allowed it. That allowance, fragile and almost trembling, ignited a spark within him. The room, once stark and foreboding, became alive with texture. The rough weave of the blanket under his paws, the faint squeak of her chair when she shifted, the metallic echo of rain against the roof, all became part of their dialogue. Every sound, every scent, every shadow contributed to a language that only they could speak. He pawed at the blanket again, and this time she leaned down slightly, fingertips brushing the soft curve of his fur. A shiver ran through both of them, hers quiet and hesitant, his instinctive and raw, the two vibrations merging in a single, fragile pulse of recognition. He pressed closer, nudging her hand with his nose, and when she allowed him to rest his head against her knee, the room seemed to exhale. She didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. The warmth radiating from his small body seeped into her like sunlight through a crack in a storm-battered window. And in that shared silence he understood something remarkable. Trust wasn't demanded. Trust wasn't forced. Trust was coaxed, a delicate tremor that grew stronger with patience and presence. Even as shadows lengthened and the drizzle painted streaks across the windows, they remained locked in that quiet negotiation. He would paw, she would allow. He would whine softly, and she would respond with the barest shift of her posture, a subtle acknowledgement. With every movement, every hesitation, every tiny, weighted interaction, the chasm between fear and hope narrowed. And though neither of them could name it yet, the fragile thread that had begun to form was stronger than the room, stronger than the rain, stronger than the long years of solitude and mistrust that she had carried like a second skin. In those trembling hours, the puppy began to teach her and herself how to breathe with someone else, how to soften, how to let warmth seep in, even when it terrified her. By the third week, the room was no longer a place of cold shadows. The puppy had claimed it in ways both subtle and profound, a curl of fur on the blanket where he had settled, a soft nudge at her hand whenever she lingered too long in silence, a small wet nose pressing into her palm as if to say, "I am here. I will stay." She noticed these gestures at first almost unconsciously, her hand lingering longer on his head, the faint tilt of her lips betraying a smile she thought she had forgotten how to make. He became a pulse within the room, a living rhythm she had begun to follow without realizing it. Morning light fell in long, golden shafts through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. The puppy bounded toward the sunbeam, paws clicking softly, tumbling into it with abandon. She watched him, shoulders relaxed for the first time, her chest rising and falling in deeper, calmer breaths. The simplicity of his joy was contagious. He rolled onto his back, exposing his soft belly, eyes bright, tail wagging with unguarded excitement. It was impossible not to notice, impossible not to feel drawn into the radiance of his presence, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to mirror it, letting herself relax, letting the tension that had clung to her like second skin loosen, if only a fraction. He learned the cadence of her moods, the subtle cues that had once been invisible to the world. A sigh, a shift of weight, the barely there twitch of her fingers. Each became a map he navigated with instinctive precision. When she flinched or tensed, he hesitated, nudging gently but never overwhelming. When she softened, he pressed closer, body curled against hers, warm breath tickling the back of her hand, eyes locking with hers in a quiet, wordless communion. They learned each other in ways that transcended language, a tilt of the head, a paw resting lightly on her arm, the soft exhalation of a sigh in the same instant. Each gesture, each shared moment became a heartbeat entwined with the other, a rhythm that neither had dared imagine until now. Rainstorms became their shared sanctuary. The pitter-patter of water against the roof, the smell of damp earth drifting through the slightly open windows, the muted gray light pooling across the tiles, all of it transformed into a private symphony. He would curl against her side on the blanket, pressing into her warmth, and she would allow herself to stroke the fur along his back, noticing the rise and fall of his small chest in tandem with her own. The room hummed with quiet life, the kind that carries with it subtle revelations. That connection is not always loud, that trust is built in small increments, that the simplest touch can echo louder than years of spoken words. Occasionally, he would pause mid-step and look at her, eyes dark, shimmering, almost human in their depth. In those moments, the weight of unspoken understanding hung in the air. She would meet his gaze, holding it, letting it linger, and he would respond with the smallest of gestures. A tilt of the head, a lick at her knuckle, a gentle pawing motion that asked permission without demanding it. She began to anticipate his movements, adjusting her own to accommodate his rhythm, learning to breathe in sync with the tiny pulses of life he offered. Their lives, once parallel and lonely, began to converge in these quiet, unassuming ways. Even mundane acts carried newfound significance. Pouring water into his bowl, watching him lap it eagerly, became a ritual of intimacy. Handing him a blanket to settle on, letting him curl into the folds, became a demonstration of mutual care. She began to laugh softly when he tumbled clumsily over his own paws, chasing shadows on the floor. And when she spoke, even in a whisper, he responded, ears swiveling, eyes following every subtle shift of her lips. By the end of the day, the room was no longer empty, no longer a stage of tension and isolation. It vibrated with the quiet hum of shared lives, of hearts learning to beat in tandem. And yet, the growth was fragile. Every time a sudden sound, a clap of thunder, a gust of wind rattling the window, made her startle, he would press closer, nuzzling into her warmth, reminding her that she was not alone. He became her anchor, steady and patient, teaching her that vulnerability was not weakness, that leaning into connection could be both terrifying and exhilarating. And in the stillness of the evening, as golden light faded to muted gray, she allowed herself to rest her hand on his soft, warm head, closing her eyes briefly, feeling the pulse of life that had slowly become entwined with her own. In those moments, fleeting and profound, the once impenetrable walls around her heart began to crumble, brick by brick, fur by fur, heartbeat by heartbeat. The storm came without warning. Sudden and violent, like the memories she had spent years trying to bury. Rain lashed against the roof and windows, wind tearing through the trees outside, rattling branches like a drumbeat of chaos. Inside, the puppy froze first, ears flattened, body tense, small paws pressed into the tiles as though bracing against the invisible forces pressing down. He sniffed the air, catching the subtle shift in her, the way her chest tightened, her hands clenched, her eyes darting toward the source of fear before she even recognized it. He didn't move away. Instinct and loyalty held him rooted, eyes dark and unwavering, as though saying, "I'm here. You don't have to face this alone." A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the room for an instant in stark, white light. Her breath hitched sharply, a tremor of terror that made her knees wobble. The puppy sprang forward instinctively, pressing himself against her side, paws warm against her leg, head nudging under her arm. She stiffened, hands frozen. But the small heat of his body, the gentle weight of his trust pressing against her, forced her to breathe. His eyes locked with hers, wide and pleading, yet calm in the midst of the storm. The juxtaposition was impossible to ignore. The world outside roared, her past clawed at the walls of her mind, and yet this small creature radiated a steadiness that defied the chaos. He whimpered softly, a gentle, insistent sound that threaded through the room, winding its way into the cracks of her armor. Her hands shook as she reached down to stroke his fur, her fingers brushing the wet strands around his ears. The act, small and almost imperceptible, became monumental. She was leaning into something she had feared for years, the possibility of comfort, of trust, of presence, and he was teaching her without words that courage could be quiet, that facing the storm didn't mean standing alone. He pressed closer, warm and small, chest rising and falling against hers, tail flicking in nervous anticipation. Thunder rolled again and she flinched involuntarily, a sharp inhale followed by a brief freeze. The puppy reacted immediately, nose nudging her hand, paw brushing her knee, eyes wide with what seemed like understanding. He could not speak, could not explain, yet his presence demanded a response, a willingness to let herself lean, to accept care, to exist in tandem rather than isolation. She exhaled slowly, tracing the small, curved line of his back, letting the warmth of his body seep into her frozen muscles. The room's textures, tiles slick with rain from the open window, the damp edges of blankets, the soft fur under her hand, became grounding points, tiny anchors against the storm raging both outside and within. Hours passed in this delicate balance of fear and courage. The storm continued its relentless assault on the house, branches scraping the siding, rain hammering the windows, the occasional gust making the panes shudder. Yet the puppy remained steadfast, a constant, warm presence against her side. She found herself whispering, first a single word, then more, soft syllables she had thought lost to the emptiness of her past. His ears twitched, his eyes followed every motion, his small body pressing closer with each exhale she allowed herself. Trust had become an active negotiation, each moment weighted with the possibility of retreat or acceptance. At some point, the storm softened to a steady drum of rain, the wind's howl reduced to a distant murmur. She realized she was no longer gripping the edge of the chair, no longer holding herself rigid against fear. The puppy's warmth, his insistence on proximity, and his unspoken patience had guided her through the chaos. She rested her head near his chest, brushing his soft, warm fur, allowing herself to breathe fully for the first time in what felt like years. The connection between them had deepened into something nearly sacred, forged in the tension of terror and the quiet courage of small bodies leaning into one another. Outside, clouds began to thin, streaks of pale light cutting through the gray. Inside, the room hummed with calm, a gentle resonance born of shared endurance. The puppy nudged her once more, soft, insistent, asking only that she acknowledge the present moment, that she feel the quiet miracle of survival and trust. And as she leaned into him, letting her trembling hands rest fully on his back, she understood something fundamental. Storms were inevitable, both inside and out, but they could be weathered together. The tiny, steadfast pulse of his life had become her compass, a reminder that connection, even fragile, could guide her through any tempest. For the first time she smiled without hesitation, and he responded with a soft bark, tail wagging slowly, body relaxed but alert. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within her had shifted as well. And in the quiet aftermath, she let herself feel, let herself trust, letting the warmth of a small, determined puppy illuminate a path she had long believed lost. Morning arrived slowly, stretching pale gold fingers through the window panes, illuminating the small room in a soft, forgiving light. The puppy stirred first, tiny paws kneading the blanket, nose twitching as he sniffed the warm air, searching for signs of life and presence. The rain from last night had left a faint, earthy scent that clung to the corners of the room, and somewhere outside, birds began to sing, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. He yawned, small pink tongue curling, eyes squinting against the new light, and nudged her gently with his wet nose. She stirred in response, eyes blinking slowly, chest rising and falling in rhythms no longer constricted by fear. The quiet intimacy between them was tangible, a fragile warmth that filled the space once heavy with shadows. He padded closer, tail wagging softly, and pressed against her side. She let her fingers sink into his fur, feeling the warmth and weight of his small body. Every muscle, every heartbeat beneath her hand, told her he had been waiting, watching, guarding, and teaching her without a word. She breathed in the faint scent of his fur, earthy and alive, and felt something within herself unfurl, a small, tentative opening, like the first blossom in a long wintered garden. For the first time in years she allowed herself to simply be, to inhabit the same space as another living being without the walls of fear, judgment, or doubt separating them. He nudged her hand again, this time curling into her lap, resting his chin lightly on her knee. The gentle press of his body, warm and soft, was a quiet insistence. "I am here. We are here. You are safe." She exhaled long and unbroken, letting the tension she hadn't realized she carried slip from her shoulders. His breathing was a rhythm she could follow, soft and steady, punctuating the quiet room in a way that mirrored her own slow, deliberate heartbeat. She stroked his fur along the spine, feeling the fine, silky texture under her fingers, and realized she had never known such a simple, profound form of trust. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath, as though the first light itself recognized the fragile miracle within these walls. Sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, illuminating the edges of the room in soft amber hues, painting the tiles in fleeting patterns of gold. The puppy's eyes caught the light, shimmering like dark jewels, and he tilted his head, small and curious, as if to share in the wonder. She smiled then, a smile that was unguarded, honest, radiant with relief and affection. For the first time, she saw herself reflected not in the shadows of fear or loss, but in the warm, steady presence of this small, unwavering creature who had taught her how to trust. Every movement was a conversation, subtle and unspoken. He nudged her palm with his nose, pawed gently at her wrist, and settled more fully against her side. She responded by leaning closer, pressing her cheek briefly against the soft curve of his head, breathing in the warmth and vitality he offered. The world outside continued, birds singing, leaves rustling, sunlight growing stronger. But the small room was a universe unto itself, filled with the quiet poetry of connection. He had shown her that love was not sudden or dramatic. It was a persistent, gentle presence that asked nothing and gave everything in return. The morning stretched into hours, each moment a delicate affirmation of trust. She moved slowly, reaching for a cup of water for him, watching his tail flick in anticipation, his ears alert, his body relaxed yet responsive. She let him climb into her lap, curl against her warmth, and felt the astonishing simplicity of being seen and accepted, wholly and without reservation. He nudged her again, small wet nose brushing against her hand, and she laughed softly, a sound like a chime breaking through silence. In that laughter, he wagged his tail faster, tongue lolling, eyes gleaming with joy, and she realized how profoundly life could shift in the presence of patient love. By mid-morning, the room had transformed entirely. Where once there had been shadows, tension, and quiet walls, now there was light, warmth, and the soft hum of shared existence. The puppy lay curled against her, ears twitching occasionally at the sounds outside, but never straying, always present. She rested her hand on his back, fingertips tracing the subtle rise and fall of his chest, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. The storm within her had passed, but more importantly, it had been transformed into something new: openness, trust, and the possibility of love. In that quiet, golden light, she whispered a single word, unpracticed yet sincere: "Thank you." The puppy tilted his head, dark eyes meeting hers with an understanding that seemed to stretch beyond time, beyond words. He gave a soft whine, not of complaint, but of acknowledgement, and nestled closer. Outside, the sun finally broke free from the clouds entirely, spilling light across the world. Inside, the warmth of two hearts intertwined filled the room completely. The small, determined pulse of the puppy's life had illuminated a path she had long thought lost. And in the gentle, unassuming rhythm of shared breath and soft fur, she understood fully. First light was not the sun breaking the horizon. It was the quiet awakening of trust and the miraculous presence of a small, unwavering soul who had taught her how to hope again.